Friends, good morning. Last time was the last lecture of the series that we had been running for a few months, and the series was the English novel, and this month we devote to general topics on literature. There will be 4 lectures, and this is the first one in that series, and next time, that is next month, we will be starting a new series on which planning work is going on, and I'll at the appropriate time inform you through this kind of program. Today's lecture, general lecture, is by Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, University of Delhi, and her topic is literature as history. And all of us have been hearing history for a long time in the discussions about literature. In fact, history is so popular a word in English literature that even novels are called history, even plays are called history. And if you go to Shakespeare, he will say history of Hamlet. Fielding in the 18th century would say history of Tom Jones. So what is this word history doing in literature in general and English literature in particular? So we were wondering and thought that we should take it up as literature and history as a topic of discussion. So I begin by putting a proposition, a kind of an idea to Dr. Bajaj, and I say that what we live in our surroundings, the problems that we face, and those problems were not born today, they were born yesterday, and they'll take us to the future. Now this process of going to the past, learning from there, intelligently working in one's own period, and then leaving a legacy for the others to follow in future. Now this is a process, and this process perhaps can be used for explaining what history is. I mean, I'm just giving an idea, giving a perception, and what is history? I don't know. I wonder as to what history actually is, and there is a discussion about it. These days, of course, there is not just history, but there is also historiography. So ask a historian and he will give a long discussion on what history is and what the method of history is and all those things, connected ones. And in fact, history in the social sciences goes to economic history, political history, ideological history. So whatever you have, you just, the word history is completely unavoidable. So what according to you, Dr. Bajaj, is history to begin with, and then we can come to literature?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Anand Prakash. I would like to respond to, before going to history, in fact, I'd like to respond to what you said as a process of living that we speak of today. Let's begin with the lived experience itself and then go to a conceptual understanding of history, I'd say, in the sense that if we look at our lived experience, then of course you're right in saying that we draw something from the past and are aware of the future, and the idea of the legacy that you spoke of, that we want to leave something for the future generation, that of course idea comes in because we have drawn strength from the past. And I think if we go into the past of just, I'm not making a sweeping statement, but if you go into the history of civilization itself, you find that because human beings could create what could be called collective memory, they were able to move forward and progress. If each generation were to start from scratch and didn't have anything from the past, didn't receive a whole set of knowledge or collective memory and knowledge that has been accumulated over centuries, then where would we be? Again, each generation, if we decided to not educate them and not give them a sense of what has been achieved, where we have come from times immemorial, then that civilization, that generation would have to deal with all the questions that previous generations dealt with: how to fend themselves, how to defend, how to attack, how to build houses. If we didn't have this history, if we didn't have this knowledge and this collective memory, if this collective memory wasn't preserved, then where would we be? So in that sense, I feel that collective memory and passing down of that knowledge that has been once received, achieved, or some kind of conclusions drawn. Of course, these conclusions were checked time and again, and hypotheses were checked, and time and again science brought in new revelations and new understanding to a sense of how we lived and who controlled us and all those questions that we dealt with. But we have what we are today, we of course owe it to our previous generations and to the centuries that have gone behind us. So I think being situated in the moment and the awareness that we add to that collective memory for the future generation that would occupy the world have give us a sense of importance, but also gives us a sense of purpose to be able to do something in the present that may add to the existing knowledge. And hence this the past and the point of history also gives us strength, in the sense gives us the confidence that if the generation before us could do it, so could we. And so we gain confidence, and a sense of self-worth is derived from this understanding of the past. So if we look at history not as some concept and some definition in then we are actually looking at a lived experience that keeps getting added with other lived experiences, and finally is moving in a direction. Of course, the simplistic sort of understanding of history is to look at sequence of events, right? To look at a chronological sequence of events wherein we merely put the dots together and we create a kind of chronology of events, and then we say that and we base it on facts and truths, dates to corroborate those events, and therefore we seem to talk about it as history. Also, mostly history is something that we think of in the sense of past. We seldom think of history as contemporary or future oriented. When somebody speaks of history, then one is constantly thinking of the past. For instance, we can say history of literature, history of a civilization, history of a country. All the time we are referring to a past. But while talking about the past, we are actually also talking about the present, and that is a dimension of history that one should be aware of, that how much of the past lives in us. And do we say that there has been a direct sort of a delinking that has happened between the past and the present? Whether we live today in the moment and live in a sort of a vacuum, or live in a sort of a time warp, or are we a continuation of that past? If we just come down to personal histories, for instance, and this is where literature actually finds its voice. I think literature, even when it talks about the larger historical phenomena, comes down to talking about real, actual human beings who lived at a particular time, perhaps. And in this,
we can take this later, the aspect of literature. But you have used two very important words. The one is lived experience, and the second is collective memory. This is your view, and this is my view also. But do you think this is an accepted view in the contemporary world, that lived experience is history and that collective memory is history? What do people say?
That's what I'm saying. So there is, of course, and I wouldn't say that. I would say this is a dimension of looking at history, and there are several other dimensions, perhaps equally important in that sense. But the very basic. If I were to ask a layman what history is, then that person would tell me that it's about the past. It's about what happened in 1900, 1950, probably some dates, some historic events. That made them historic. We speak of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, India's War of Independence, all those world wars. These are historic events in that sense, because they were points in time that changed the way society was lived.
Now the nomenclature is changing. For instance, earlier there used to be histories,
right.
And now there is people's history.
Right.
Now there is history from below. And when there is people's history, then one can assume that histories would have been written from other angles, and somebody now has started writing in the 20th century, from the people's angle.
Right.
It's a very important phrase.
You see, I think the difference is between what so far I was talking about was history as a lived experience and history as it is documented. Now, the moment we look at history as understood and as lived and as as a part of popular imagination, and then history as it it gets documented. Now, if you, in fact, if I could take our readers to, just the point of different kinds of histories that work along all the way, then you can see on the screen, readers, viewers, that there are some, history could be seen as one. Of course, the question is history about the past or the present. That's the basic question that I also floated today. The other point of political histories and local history. So there can be political histories which talks about political events and chronicle facts according to around those political events and facts, and a sequence of wars, who took which battle and who took power and who came to power, who was the emperor. So we tend to talk about political histories in terms of the person who held power at that time and the events and facts around battles that were won and wars that were fought. Then there are local histories where people, histories that are now seen as something which are more subaltern histories, in the sense where people's own histories have been coming out and they have been written by the people and are about of the people, and they generally are about provincial identities, about ethnic identities, about small groups that want to be heard, Dalit identities, among others. So you see, these are local histories of the time which in a way challenge a kind of a mainstream history or a kind of a centrist view of things. So there are minority groups, marginalized histories that have now been seen as part of subaltern studies or subaltern histories. Now these constitute local histories that have now come up and are contributing and are adding to different dimensions of that mainstream history or political histories, which was mostly about heroes, leaders and their lives, or emperors. Now local histories tries to build on the people's experience and what Professor Anand Prakash has mentioned, people's histories. So these are now coming up as alternate forms of histories which are now challenging the mainstream one. Apart from these, we also see certain other categories such as national histories, global histories, popular histories. Now national histories are meant to basically support the cause of national unity. It might get jingoistic, it might get patriotic, but the whole point of such histories is to be able to visualize a particular place on the continent as a nation, and therefore a nation needs to build a history which talks about national events, that also talks about events that were important in the nation building process. So national histories tend to move around not a particular figure per se, but if that figure assists in supporting national unity or giving a national vision, then that figure is also added in. But national histories are more concerned with the place and the country and the kind of the mode of living of that country, as against political histories or local histories. So it's not people centric per se, it is based on some laws and rules of the land, and that is what mostly national histories work on. Then there are global histories. Now global histories try to really negate the very concept of national histories, and subjects all nations to a sort of an overall guiding principle. You may call it universalism, you may call it internationalism, as you like, but all these histories seem to look at human civilization as together, and given the pandemic situation, somehow the narrative of the global history has come together and is one of the example of where all nations converge and seem to look at themselves as one people and seem to look at the history of human civilization as as an important category as against national local histories. Now interestingly, there are terms, there is also a category like popular history, which tries to not work on any of the documentation facts, in fact often goes against professional histories or historiography, which is the right methodology or the method of dealing with histories, and in fact is more based on rumor, hearsay, conjecture, and becomes a part of or captures the popular imagination.
Would you agree with me if I say that at the center of history is reality and fact? Would you agree?
Reality and fact. Yes, of course. I mean that is what is the chase of history. at least. Reality and fact is what history is really chasing and is trying to pin it down. Of course, there are, even in histories, there are a lot of dimensions and a lot of viewpoints that would counter one or the other, and therefore finding is based on probable truths, I would say, and we are at best in a position to reach those probable truths, which may inform us something about reality, about, again,
because you use the word documented. So I thought that you require proofs to cite in order to establish
certainly history, and that is, again, perhaps we'll deal with this question later, but proof is something that history is bent on providing, unlike literature, which can take creative license. Right, so history has to provide proof, history has to provide some estimation, even if it doesn't give us the exact date. Without documented proofs and facts, history wouldn't be able to make that hypothesis a real point. So, and therefore, this is the these different points that I raised. These are all the different ways in which, as you asked me, how has history been seen by people? How has history been approached in our own times? So these are different ways in which, if one were to talk about the concept of history and to categorize them and to talk about them, but according to me, these don't do justice to the idea of history, which lies not in categorizations per se, but in having a sort of a vision of the times, whether past or present.
What does do justice according to you to history?
So a lot of things, and for this I would like to in fact bring in a quote from Leo Huberman, and that may bring us closer to the point. Now, Leo Huberman, in his book Man's Worldly Goods, raises this important question as to what exactly is history if it is not all of that. Let's see what he says, and I quote, "What is your philosophy of history? Do you believe that historical events are largely a matter of chance? That they are merely accidents with no connecting theme running throughout? Or do you believe that historical changes are due to the power of idea? Or do you believe that historical movements can be traced to the influence of great men?" Right? End quote. Now, this is these are the questions that he raises. Huberman raises, what is history? He of course addresses the reader, and he says, "What, according to you, is history?" So, can we say that things just happen out of it's a coincidence that one thing happened after another, and it's just a series of accidents? Could we call history that, a series of accidents, or could we call history? Do we say that history has some kind of a connection? Is there a connection between a kind of a running connection between the and can we find the cause and the effect, as we generally do in several things in history? And if so, then or is it that ideas cause historical changes, and or it's that leaders bring in historical changes or lead to give push to the historical
after
movement?
This very fine discussion about history, I believe that literature seems to have no place in the historical scheme of things, because literature is unreal. It is merely words, it's merely stories, it is fantasies, it's imagination. So can you accuse literature of being completely unhistorical and outside history?
I cannot actually. I would let me complete Huberman's point.
Okay.
According to Huberman, he says that and I quote, his own answer to the question is that the movement of history and the changes that take place in society are, according to him, the result or the working out of economic forces of society. Now, whether it is economic forces or not, we need to at least acknowledge that there are forces in society that are active at a given historical time. And when these forces are active, then what is their role? How do they impinge on the lives of the people? Now, these are the questions that that come in when you think of literature also. So, does literature then reflect a historical truth? Is the basic question, as you said, that where does literature stand in all of this? Literature has a place because there is at a particular time a kind of a historical consciousness that comes into play that people seem to have. And this it could be just it could be just the historical origins of things. It could be the historicity of the very cultural forms and practices that exist in our lives that we participate in, and they are peculiar today and may not be tomorrow. So definitely they have this sense of specificity and peculiarity in terms of a historical time. Again, the point that a particular historical period can never be repeated, right? Because it may be, and when it is when you bring it to another time, then it looks like a patchwork, right? And it becomes a sort of a parody in another context. So in one case it could be history in its actual period, but if we try to revoke it and to bring it back, then we cannot bring that time back. There must be something else to replace it.
You used the good word consciousness for the first time in your discussion. So do you think the consciousness is central to literature?
Certainly. You see, historical consciousness is at the center of literature, and the historical experience, you see, this experience leads to this consciousness. The history, as I said, as it impinges the lives of actual people who also have a sense of the past but also have a view of the future. So having a sense of the past and a view of the future is an enabling experience in itself, and then to know that you are situated somewhere in between these periods, while you have seen the success of or the failure of things in the past, you are aware of contributing to in that moment to see certain other successes and failures. So the very experience and feeling in the moment gets connected with the larger historical period, or the dominant forces active at a particular historical period. And again, to me, as you said, where history connects with literature, it is more to, it's when the forces of history or the dominant forces, or even the, marginal forces are trying to find space in the current times, and then and they don't get space in history. They don't get space, at least in documented mainstream history. The alternate way through which they register their presence or they assert is through literature. So a lot of history may have marginalized one group or another at a particular period in time, but literature gives space and scope to these parallel personal histories or marginal histories, and is able to can provide space to these alternate narratives.
Let's go through the same process. What is literature? How do you understand literature, popularly or from the specialist angle?
See, again, literature is one. I wouldn't say. Let me also make that clear that I don't think that literature is history. I'm not very sure to what extent literature reflects history, but certainly literature is a take on the times, which is historical in nature. I mean, how do you take history out of anything from our lives? We are placed in a historical time. We have a context, and to overlook the context, and to which also has been done. There have been several movements in literature that have tried to dissociate literature from history. If we look at Arts for Art's Sake, for instance, or if we look at Wimsatt and Beardsley's idea of the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy, wherein the intent is totally kept away and you cut off from the intent of the writer, and the in affective fallacy you cut off from the reader. So you see the text out just in itself, what it presents. Another instance of it is new criticism that took shape in both America and Europe. So all these literary movements have tried to dissociate history from literature.
Rightly or wrongly?
Well, I don't find them appealing at all, because for aesthetics, if one were to look at aesthetics also, they might appeal to some. But again, personally, aesthetics doesn't stand anywhere without its context in itself. Aesthetics also changes. So to be focusing on words and to be focusing on meaning that exists within the text for the pleasure principle is the larger thought process that goes into creating this kind of experimentation in writing that occurs at this level, at the level of in new criticism or intentional or affective fallacy.
I'll ask a simple question. Simple question is, and first let me also give the answer to that question myself, and then I'll ask you whether that answer is valid. I believe that literature gives credence to feelings, and those feelings bear the imprint of history, as you call it. But when I'm writing a poem, let's say, when I'm expressing my feelings through a poem, how does it relate to history? I think the times are putting pressure on me. I'm sad, I'm happy, I'm celebrating, I'm bemoaning. All those things that are happening are at the level of writing, at the level of expressing my feelings. But there would also be perhaps a connection between sadness in an individual's life and what is happening in the circumstance.
Certainly, I would say that literature has connection with history simply because you have connection with history. Because the self is not created in vacuum and does not exist in vacuum. So the fact that you are a product of a particular time in history connects with what you do, whatever that may be, whatever creative practice that may be. It connects it with your times. That would be my answer.
So friends, so far we have sorted out the question of what history is, how it appeals, and now we'll be taking up the connection of history with the literature in the discussion that will follow. Thank you.